The night Sid Calloway's son told him he couldn't sleep in the house anymore. It was 22 degrees outside, and the wind off the Bitterroot Valley was cutting straight through the walls of the old detached workshop like they were made of paper. Sid didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing with Mitchell about 3 years ago, sometime around when Mitchell married Renee, and the whole gravitational pull of the family shifted toward whatever Renee wanted. He just nodded, picked up the wool blanket he'd had since Fort Bragg, and walked across the frozen gravel in his socks because he couldn't find his boots fast enough, and he wasn't going to give either of them the satisfaction of watching him search. The workshop smelled like motor oil and sawdust. Sid sat down on an overturned milk crate and listened to the wind, and the old German shepherd named Duke crawled out from under the workbench and laid his big gray-muzzled head across Sid's knee without being asked. That dog always knew. Sid was 68 years old. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam, one in '68 and one in '71. He came home both times with his legs working and his mind mostly intact, which was more than he could say for some of the men he'd served with. He'd spent 30 years after that working maintenance for the county road department in Stevensville, Montana, waking up at 5 in the morning without an alarm because his body had never learned how to sleep in. He'd raised 2 kids in a 4-bedroom house on Tamarack Street, put them both through college, stood at his wife Carol's bedside in the Ravalli County Medical Center when the cancer took her in 2019, and held her hand until it went cold. And now he was sitting in his own workshop in his socks while his son slept in his bed. It had started small, the way these things always do. Mitchell lost his job at the lumberyard in 2022, and Sid said, "Of course, come stay a while, you and Renee both. There's room." And there was room for a while. But Renee started making comments about the house. The carpet was outdated. The kitchen needed updating. The neighborhood wasn't right for them long term. At first, Sid thought she just meant they needed to find their own place. It took him longer than it should have to understand she meant his place. By Thanksgiving of that year, Renee had repainted the living room without asking. By Christmas, she'd moved Carol's rocking chair into the garage. Sid brought it back inside and didn't say a word about it, just set it in the corner where it had always been. And Renee looked at him with that particular expression she had. Not angry, just impatient, like he was a problem to be managed. Mitchell didn't say anything. That was the part that stayed with Sid. Not Renee's maneuvering. Renee was Renee. She'd never pretended to be anything other than what she was. But Mitchell, his own son, just stood in the doorway with his coffee mug and looked somewhere over Sid's shoulder and didn't say a single word. Duke pressed harder against Sid's leg in the workshop and made a low sound in his throat. "I know," Sid said. He was still sitting there at 2 in the morning when the phone rang. He almost didn't answer it. The number was a Missoula area code he didn't recognize, and at that hour his first thought was that it was a scam. But something made him pick up. Some old military instinct that said, when something breaks the silence at 2 a.m., you answer it. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Patricia Slade, and she was a paralegal with Whitmore and Associates out of Missoula. She apologized for the hour and explained she'd been trying to reach him since the previous afternoon. She said that a man named George Abbott had passed away 11 days earlier. She said George Abbott had named Sid as the sole beneficiary of his estate. Sid sat very still for a moment. George Abbott. He hadn't heard that name in almost 40 years. George had been in Sid's unit in '71, a quiet kid from Whitefish who was the best shot Sid had ever seen, and who read Louis L'Amour paperbacks in the dark somehow. By feel almost like he'd memorized every page. They'd kept up for a few years after the war, exchanged Christmas cards. Then the cards stopped the way they do, and life filled in the silence. Sid hadn't known George was still in Montana, hadn't known much of anything about him. "What kind of estate?" Sid asked. There was a brief pause. "I think it would be better to discuss the details in person, Mr. Calloway. Are you available to come to our offices?" He went the next morning, with Duke riding shotgun in the cab of his F-150, which was the only vehicle he had left. After Renee had quietly suggested that the family could make better use of the driveway space, and maybe Sid should consider parking on the street, the paralegal met him in a conference room that smelled like fresh carpet and stale coffee. She laid out the documents carefully, and Sid read them twice because his reading glasses were scratched, and also because he needed the extra time to understand what he was seeing. George Abbott had owned 43 acres in the Clearwater National Forest region, up along a creek drainage east of the Selway River. On that property was a cabin, a hand-built log structure that George had put up himself over the course of about 6 years, starting in 1987. There was also a small outbuilding, a generator shed, a hand-dug well, and according to the survey documents, road access via seasonal Forest Service track that was passable most of the year if you had four-wheel drive. "Is it worth anything?" Sid asked, because he was a practical man, and he'd learned not to attach sentiment to things before he understood their value. Patricia Slade folded her hands on the table. "The land itself has some value, yes. The timber rights are complicated because of the Forest Service adjacency. The cabin is structurally sound as of the last inspection, which was about 4 years ago." She paused. "Mr. Abbott lived there full-time until about 2 years ago when his health declined. He moved to assisted living in Missoula." "I didn't know that," Sid said. "He left a letter for you." She slid an envelope across the table. It was sealed, Sid's name written on the front in a handwriting he didn't recognize, old and shaky, not the handwriting he remembered from Christmas cards decades ago. He put it in his breast pocket and didn't open it until he was back in the truck with Duke. "Sid," the letter began, "I know this is out of nowhere, and I'm sorry for that. I don't have anyone else to leave it to, and I don't trust the county to just let it sit. I spent 30 years building something real up there, and I don't want it bulldozed or sold to some developer who'll put up vacation cabins and call it heritage. You were the most honest man I ever knew in the Army, and I figure that hasn't changed. The land has everything you need. Whatever else you find up there, well, Duke always did like to dig. Give a good dog a good home." Sid read it twice. Then he sat for a long time looking at the Missoula skyline through the windshield. George didn't know Sid had a dog. Couldn't have known. But that last line sat in Sid's chest in a way he couldn't explain. He told Mitchell that night. He was precise about it. Laid out the facts clearly. Location, acreage, the cabin. He watched his son's face go through a sequence of expressions that Sid knew how to read after 68 years of watching people's faces. First surprise, then calculation, then the particular tightening around the eyes that meant money was being counted. 43 acres up near the Selway? Mitchell said. "Dad, that land could be worth." "It's mine," Sid said. Renee came in from the kitchen. She had the ability to materialize whenever numbers were being discussed, which Sid had long since stopped finding coincidental. "What's going on?" Mitchell told her. Sid watched her face do the same sequence, only faster, because Renee was sharper than Mitchell in this particular way. "Well," she said, setting her glass on the counter. "Obviously the right thing would be to sell and split the proceeds. You don't need 40 acres, Sid. You're almost 70. "It's mine," Sid said again. "Nobody's saying it isn't yours. We're saying what's the practical, Renee." Sid picked up his coffee cup. "I'm going to go up there and take a look at it. When I've done that, I'll decide what I want to do with it. That's the conversation we're having tonight. That's the only conversation we're having tonight." She looked at Mitchell. Mitchell looked at the floor. Sid drove up on a Thursday in early April, when the seasonal road had been passable for about 2 weeks according to the Forest Service District Office. He took Duke and a week's worth of supplies, and the scratched reading glasses and George's letter in his breast pocket, even though he'd already memorized it. The road was exactly as advertised. 4 miles of rutted 2-track that climbed through second-growth Douglas fir and crossed 2 shallow creek fords before breaking into a clearing where the cabin sat facing south, catching the early spring light on its front porch like it was holding its face up to the sun. Sid sat in the truck for a moment and just looked at it. George had built something real, all right. The logs were hand-peeled, the chinking was intact, the roof was metal and relatively new. Someone had re-roofed it in the last decade. There was a covered porch with 2 old wooden chairs that had weathered to silver. A rusted coffee can on the porch railing still held 2 dried-out paintbrushes. Duke was out of the truck before Sid even got the door fully open, nose down, moving in wide circles across the clearing, with his tail working slow and steady the way it did when he found a scent interesting. Sid unlocked the cabin with the key Patricia Slade had given him and stepped inside. It was cold and it smelled like wood smoke and thyme. The main room had a stone fireplace, a kitchen along the back wall, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood stove in the corner that had probably heated the space on nights when the fireplace alone wasn't enough. There were shelves along one wall holding a surprising number of books, mostly westerns, a few history books, a field guide to Montana birds. On the mantel was a photograph Sid didn't recognize. 2 men in uniform, young and squinting against hard sunlight. He picked it up and looked at it for a long time before he understood that one of them was George in 1971, and the other one was himself. He didn't remember this photograph being taken. He couldn't imagine where George had gotten it. He set it back on the mantel carefully. Duke came in through the door Sid had left open and went straight to the fireplace. He sniffed along the stone's base, then along the floor in front of it. Then he sat down and looked at Sid with that expression he had, steady, expectant, slightly disapproving, like a foreman waiting for someone to notice the obvious. "What?" Sid said. Duke looked at the floor. Sid crouched down. The floorboards in front of the fireplace were slightly different from the rest. Same wood, same age, but the grain ran a different direction, and the boards were cut in a rectangle that didn't match the standard flooring pattern. He ran his fingers along the seam. A thin groove, worn smooth but deliberate. He looked for a gap wide enough to get a grip and found it at the far edge, a small carved notch just deep enough for 2 fingers. The panel lifted, not a full floor section, just a 2-foot square access door, hinged on one side, that opened to reveal a short wooden ladder and a space below. Duke's tail moved steadily. Sid got a flashlight from his truck and climbed down. The space was about 6 feet deep and maybe 8 feet square, dry as a bone. George had done something clever with the drainage. Sid could see the sloped concrete floor directing moisture toward a small sump. Along the walls were wooden shelving units, built in place, and on those shelves were things Sid needed several minutes to fully take in. There were canning jars, dozens of them, arranged by date. Sid opened one lid carefully and found it packed with tightly rolled bills, hundreds mostly, with some 50s. He counted one jar, $4,200. He looked at the shelves again and estimated conservatively that there were 40 jars, maybe more. Beside the money jars were document boxes, the kind with lids, all labeled in George's careful hand. Sid opened the first one, land deeds, going back to 1987. The second, surveying records, mineral rights documentation, easement agreements. The third made him sit back on the cold concrete floor for a long moment. Inside were stock certificates, physical certificates, which nobody issued anymore, for companies Sid had never heard of, all dated from the 1990s. There was also a stapled document from a Missoula brokerage, current as of 18 months ago, showing a portfolio value that Sid read 3 times because the number didn't seem real. At the bottom of the third box, in a sealed envelope with Sid's name on it, was a handwritten inventory. George had cataloged everything. Total currency in jars, $186,400. Portfolio current value, roughly $1.1 million. The land itself, which George had paid $12 for in 1987 and which a Helena real estate attorney had appraised 2 years ago conservatively at $340,000 given current timber and recreational land values. There was a note at the bottom of the inventory in the same shaky handwriting as the letter. I lived simply. I didn't need much. This is what simple living and patience looks like over 40 years. It's yours to do what you think is right. I trust you. Sid sat in that basement for a long time with the flashlight in his lap and Duke watching him from the top of the ladder. He drove back to Stevensville on Sunday. He didn't tell Mitchell or Renee what he'd found. He called Patricia Slade on Monday and asked her to refer him to an estate attorney, which she did. A man named Owen Blackwell in Missoula, who specialized in rural property and trusts. Sid drove back up to the city and spent 2 hours with Blackwell going over everything. It was Blackwell who called him the following Friday with a different kind of news. "Mr. Calloway, I need to inform you that your son Mitchell has filed a petition with the Ravalli County Probate Court. He's contesting the validity of the bequest." Sid was standing at the kitchen sink when he took the call. Through the window he could see Renee's car in the driveway. "On what grounds?" he said. "He's arguing that Mr. Abbott lacked testamentary capacity at the time he executed the will, that he was cognitively impaired due to his health condition, and..." Blackwell paused. "He's also filed a separate petition to have you declared partially incapacitated. He's suggesting you're not capable of managing assets of this scale." The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a crow landed on Renee's car antenna and sat there. "I see," Sid said. "I want to be clear that both of these filings are weak. The will was properly witnessed and notarized. Mr. Abbott's physician has already confirmed in a written statement that his cognitive function was intact at the time of execution. And, as for the incapacity claim," Blackwell's voice carried a dry precision that Sid was starting to appreciate. "I've seen the petition. It's thin. How long will this take? If we move efficiently, I'd say 4 to 6 months. The probate contest is the easier one to defeat. The incapacity petition is designed to tie up your access to the assets in the interim, which I suspect is the point." Sid thanked him and hung up. He went to the living room. Mitchell was on the couch watching television. Renee was in the kitchen, though Sid was certain she'd been standing in the hallway a moment ago. "You filed against me," Sid said. Mitchell didn't look away from the screen. "It's not personal, Dad," Renee's attorney said. "You filed against me in probate court," Sid said, again the same even tone. "Because he'd learned in the army that the moment you raised your voice, you ceded the high ground, and he'd spent 50 years keeping the high ground. And you filed to have me declared incompetent." Mitchell finally looked at him. He had Carol's eyes, and the skin around them looked older than it should. "We just want what's fair," he said. "Fair," Sid said. He went to the workshop. Duke followed him. He sat on the milk crate and scratched Duke's ears for a long time, not thinking about money or courts or Mitchell's eyes. Just thinking about George Abbott reading Louis L'Amour by feel in the dark, and 2 young men squinting into hard sunlight somewhere that no longer existed. The months that followed were some of the most clarifying of Sid's life. That was the word he settled on, eventually. Clarifying. Not painful, though they were that. Clarifying. Like water that runs through sand until everything suspended in it settles out and you can finally see what you're looking at. He moved up to the cabin in May, officially, because there was no longer any reason to stay in Stevensville. He and Duke drove up with the truck loaded, and he left Mitchell and Renee the house on Tamarack Street. Not permanently, just because he was done being present for their version of events. He'd deal with the property later, when the courts were finished. He spent the summer learning the land. Duke learned it faster, as dogs do. There were elk trails through the upper timber, a beaver pond on the north drainage that Duke found on day 3, and returned to obsessively, a ridgeline to the east that caught the sunrise, in a way that made Sid feel, on good mornings, like the world was brand new. He learned that George had maintained the property with a quiet and systematic care that Sid recognized from the army. The kind of attention that comes not from obligation but from love for a thing. The generator shed was meticulously organized. The hand-dug well had a concrete cap and a hand pump that worked perfectly. There was a root cellar built into the north slope that still held shelves of preserved food from 3 summers ago, sealed tight. George had not been a man who wasted anything, including his time. Blackwell called him in September, with results on the first petition. The probate contest had been dismissed. The judge had reviewed George's physician's statement, the notarized will, the testimony of the two witnesses who'd been present at execution, and found the challenge wholly without merit. He used that phrase specifically, Blackwell said. Wholly without merit. The incapacity petition was still pending but had been weakened significantly by the probate ruling, and Blackwell expected it to collapse within 30 days. It collapsed in 22. Sid got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. He was splitting firewood behind the cabin, and Duke was lying in a patch of late September sun, watching him with the deep professional attention he brought to all of Sid's outdoor activities. Blackwell read him the judge's ruling, which was brief and unambiguous, and contained the phrase "no credible evidence" twice. Sid set down the maul and leaned against the woodpile. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now the assets are fully and uncontestably yours, Mr. Calloway. You can do whatever you like with them." He thought about it for 3 days. He walked the ridgeline, sat by the beaver pond, read one of George's westerns from the shelf. Duke walked beside him for most of it, occasionally disappearing into the timber to investigate something, and reappearing with a look of satisfied professionalism. On the 4th day, Sid drove into Missoula and sat back down with Owen Blackwell and told him what he wanted to do. He wanted to establish a trust, the George Abbott Foundation. He'd already decided on the name. To provide low-cost housing and transitional support for veterans returning from service who were struggling to find stable footing. He'd seen too many of them across the years, the men who came back and slipped sideways, no structure holding them, the bottle or the streets filling in the gaps. Montana had more of them per capita than most people realized. George had known this too, Sid suspected, which was why he'd trusted the money to someone who understood what it was for. Blackwell wrote everything down carefully. The trust would be capitalized with $600,000 from George's portfolio. The remaining assets, the land, the cabin, the balance of the portfolio, and the currency from the basement, would stay with Sid. Not because he needed it all, but because the land especially was not a thing to be liquidated. George had built it over 40 years, and Sid intended to be its steward for whatever years he had left. There was one more thing. He called Mitchell on a Wednesday evening, standing on the porch of the cabin with Duke at his feet and the last light going orange over the western ridgeline. Mitchell answered on the 3rd ring. He sounded careful, the way people sound when they know a call could go several ways. "I'm not calling to fight," Sid said. "The courts are done. So is that." A pause. "Okay, your mother loved you," Sid said. "And she loved me. And I think somewhere you still know the difference between who you are and what Renee decided you should want. I'm not asking you to figure that out right now. But I wanted to say it while I still could." Another pause, longer. When Mitchell spoke, his voice was different, younger, somehow. "Dad, you don't have to say anything," Sid said. "I know where you can find me." He hung up and sat in one of the 2 silver-weathered chairs on the porch, and Duke put his chin on Sid's knee, the same way he had on the milk crate back in Stevensville. Back when it was 22 degrees, and the wind was cutting through the walls, and Sid was sitting in his socks with nowhere else to go. That felt like a long time ago. It felt like something that had happened to someone else, in a different season of a different life. Somewhere down the drainage, a great horned owl called once. And then the forest went quiet, and the last of the light left the ridgeline, and Duke's breathing slowed against Sid's leg, and neither of them moved for a long time, because there was no longer any reason to.